Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You guys know how much I love getting your requests, and well, this one is for a topic a bunch of you have been asking about for a while now. We're going to be looking at Russian and Soviet military interventions
Yeah, we could do it.
from 1945 all the way to today. And to really get into it, we're using this super in-depth analysis. It's called
Russian and
Russian and Soviet Military Interventions, 1945 present. I mean, the title kind of says it all.
straight to the point. I like it.
So yeah, today we're going to try to uncover the patterns and motivations behind these interventions and how have they impacted the world, from the Cold War all the way to the post-Soviet world.
Yeah, because I think what's really fascinating about this topic is we're not just going through a list of conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like date this happened, date that happened.
Right.
We're really trying to understand the why.
Yeah, the why.
How do they connect across these decades? Especially with this huge shift from the Soviet Union to the Russian Federation.
Exactly. Yeah. I have to admit, going into this, some of this stuff was new to me. Did you know Soviet pilots were secretly involved in the Korean War?
Oh, yeah.
I had no idea. We're going to get into that and a whole lot more.
And I think what you'll find really interesting is how even events that seem like ancient history, like decades ago,
Yeah, way back when.
they directly shaped the world that we live in today. Frozen conflicts, like simmering tensions, even the groundwork that was laid for some of the more recent events. It's all connected.
It's all connected. Okay, so let's kind of try to unpack all this. Let's start with the Soviet era, roughly 1945 to 1991. One major theme that emerges is this whole idea of consolidating control, right?
Yeah.
Projecting power during the Cold War. I mean, right away we see this with the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria.
Wow.
I mean, they all had Soviet troops within their borders.
Yeah.
That's a lot of troops in a lot of countries.
This period really sets the stage for understanding how the Soviets thought. It's about creating this buffer zone, right? Solidifying this sphere of influence to counter the Western powers. And this impact that's still being felt today. In those countries, that's for sure.
I mean, it's got to be. Okay, then there's the Korean War. Most people know about U.S. involvement there.
Right.
But I was surprised to learn about Soviet pilots, secretly flying MiG-15 fighters
Yeah.
in support of North Korea and China. I mean,
Sure.
What were their motivations? Was it just purely ideological? Or were there strategic factors there?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a bit of both. Ideologically, the Soviets saw themselves as the champions of global communism.
Sure.
And wanted to support these fellow communist regimes.
Yeah.
But strategically, the Korean War was also a chance to test their military capabilities,
Yeah.
against the U.S.
Oh.
to try to expand their influence in Asia.
Okay.
So this covert involvement just adds a whole nother layer to that Cold War rivalry that was going on.
Makes you realize just how much was going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
Okay, now the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 stands out as a really clear example of the Soviet Union's determination to maintain control. This was a nationwide uprising. They were against communist rule. So what was the Soviet response? I mean, what did they do?
Well, they went in.
Yeah.
Full-scale military intervention.
Yeah.
And they crushed the revolution. Thousands of deaths as a result of that. It was brutal. And it sent a message to the Eastern Bloc.
Right.
About limits to dissent within the Soviet sphere.
Don't even try it.
Yeah. Any threat to their power was going to be met with swift and often ruthless force.
And so how did that impact other Eastern Bloc countries? I mean, was there a sense of fear or resignation or maybe even simmering resentment that could eventually boil over?
Well, it's hard to generalize.
Yeah.
But there was probably a mix of all of those things.
Yeah.
Some people were genuinely terrified. Others felt like, what's the point? But the seeds of discontent,
Yeah.
they were sown. We see that just a few years later, 1968, in Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring,
Yeah.
you have these reformers led by Alexander Dubček, and they tried to implement more liberal policies.
I'm guessing the Soviets weren't too happy about that.
Oh, they were not happy about it at all. USSR, along with other Warsaw Pact forces, invaded Czechoslovakia to just stop these reforms in their tracks. This
Right.
wasn't just about ideology.
Right.
It was about control. The Soviets viewed any deviation from their model as a threat to their power.
So it seems like they were constantly battling these centrifugal forces
What?
to try and keep everything within their grasp. But did these suppressions, while they maintained control in the short term, Did they contribute to the Soviet Union's downfall?
I mean, that's the question.
Like, did they create deeper fractures within the system itself?
That's a very insightful question, and it's one that historians still debate. There's no doubt that these interventions had a lasting impact, both within the Soviet Union and obviously in the countries that they intervened in.
Right, of course. Okay, now, even within the communist bloc, like, there were fractures, right? There were disagreements.
Oh, yeah.
We see this with the Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969, this clash between Soviet and Chinese forces along the Ussuri River. I mean, it really highlights that even seemingly unified systems,
Right.
they have their own internal tensions and power struggles.
Absolutely. It really just shows how complex ideology and power dynamics are, even within a system that from the outside seems totally unified. And this kind of foreshadows the eventual breakup of the Soviet Union itself. You start to see internal pressures and external conflicts kind of take their toll.
Right. Okay, this brings us to, I think, a pretty pivotal moment, the Soviet-Afghan War. It lasted from 1979 to 1989. This intervention was a turning point. The Soviets basically got bogged down in this costly, unsuccessful war against the Mujahideen insurgents. And, it's often compared to the later U.S. intervention in Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I mean, what's fascinating here is that both superpowers, decades apart,
Mm,
faced very similar challenges in a country that's known for, like, its complex terrain
right.
and its fierce resistance.
Yeah, it definitely underscores this recurring theme we're going to be talking about, which is the difficulty of external powers trying to impose their will in Afghanistan because of the terrain
Yeah.
and the local resistance. And it brings up this other key question, too. Are there limits to these external interventions,
Mhm.
especially in areas with strong resistance and difficult environments?
Yeah, that's definitely something to think about for sure. But before we move on from the Soviet era, we have to talk about a couple more interventions. Angola and Ethiopia. These were proxy wars where the USSR supported socialist governments who were fighting against other groups.
Yeah, and here you really see the Soviets mastering this art of using Cuban troops and resources to advance their agenda without being directly involved militarily. It's strategy you see in a lot of modern proxy conflicts, too. So these conflicts, while they weren't directly involving Soviet troops, they were definitely still part of that Cold War struggle for global influence.
So we've seen how the Soviet Union, wielded its military might during the Cold War. But what happens when that union collapses? What happens to those motivations and tactics in a post-Soviet world? That's where we're going to pick up next as we shift our focus to Russia from 1991 to the present day.
Yeah, I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that was huge, completely reshaped the world. But even though the communist giant was gone, Russia being its largest successor state, they kind of inherited a lot of those ambitions, like the geopolitical ambitions, but they just had different limitations and priorities now.
Okay, so it's like a changing of the guard, but some of the same players are still in the game. But instead of this like worldwide ideological battle against the West, what becomes the main driving force for Russia's interventions now?
Well, you hit on a key point there. It really becomes about maintaining influence, especially in what Russia considers its like near abroad.
Okay.
You know, those former Soviet republics that were suddenly independent. Think of it as like sphere of influence 2.0. The goal isn't so much about spreading communism anymore. It's more about making sure these newly independent states don't get too close to NATO or the West.
Okay, so keeping some level of control and stopping Western influence in what they see as like their backyard.
Exactly.
What's the first intervention we see in this new era?
Well, right away in 1992, you have the Transnistria War. This is a breakaway region of Moldova. It's got a mostly Russian-speaking population. Russia intervenes militarily, backs these separatists, and get this, Russian forces are still there today. It's a frozen conflict, like a constant tension point that could just erupt at any moment.
Frozen conflict, that sounds ominous.
Yeah.
So this is part of Moldova, but Russia has a military presence there and exerts a lot of influence, even though it's not officially recognized as being part of Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it really highlights this pattern we see over and over again. Russian support for these separatist movements in nearby countries, especially areas with a lot of Russian people. It's a way to exert leverage, keep a foothold, prevent those countries from fully integrating with the West.
I see how these seemingly isolated events actually connect, like they build on each other. What comes after that?
So let's go to Tajikistan. From 1992 to 1997, you have the Tajik Civil War. Really complex situation with different factions fighting for power. Russia steps in and backs the government that's struggling to hold on. Again, you see this willingness to intervene in what they consider their sphere of influence.
So another intervention in a former Soviet republic, but this time backing the government instead of the separatists. Seems like Russia is willing to play both sides depending on what's best for them. So is this like opportunism, strategic thinking, or a little bit of both?
I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's something that people who study this stuff still debate. But what's clear is that these interventions, whether it's supporting separatists or governments, it all serves this bigger goal for Russia, maintaining influence and blocking Western expansion.
Got it. And we can't talk about this era without talking about Chechnya. There were actually two major conflicts here. The first from 1994 to 1996, and the second from 1999 to 2009. These were really brutal wars, and Russia faced a lot of resistance from Chechen separatists.
Yeah, the Chechen wars were incredibly bloody and devastating. They left a deep scar on Chechnya. For Russia, these were wars fought on their own territory, driven by this determination to stop separatism and keep their country together.
These conflicts were especially shocking to the world because of all the reports of like human rights abuses, the bombings that didn't discriminate between civilian and military targets, just the brutality of it all. I mean, it really tarnished Russia's image globally.
Absolutely. The Chechen wars raised serious questions about Russia's commitment to human rights and the rule of law.
Mm.
And the tactics that they used, especially during that Second Chechen War, had a lasting impact on the Chechen people and their views of Russia.
Do you think that the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, where they had a similar situation with a long and ultimately unsuccessful conflict, do you think that informed how they approached Chechnya? Like, did they learn any lessons or were they just making the same mistakes?
It's an interesting question. While the situations were different, there are definitely parallels. In both cases, Russia underestimated how determined the local resistance was.
Yeah.
And they didn't fully grasp the complexities of fighting in those environments. However, in Chechnya, Russia seemed to adopt a much more ruthless approach, prioritizing military victory over any concerns about civilian casualties or what the world thought of them.
It's a tragic situation. It seems like in Chechnya, Russia was just set on keeping control no matter what, even if meant using very harsh measures. Okay, so shifting gears to a later period, we come to 2008, kind of a pivotal year. This is when Russia invades Georgia, another former Soviet republic that had been getting closer to the West. The fighting focused on these two breakaway regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Does this sound familiar? It's the same playbook we saw in Transnistria.
Yeah, the Russo-Georgian War was a real wake-up call for the world. It showed that Russia, under Putin, was ready to use military force to assert its power in the region. And by saying they recognized the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Russia basically changed the map, set a dangerous precedent for future interventions.
And it seems like that precedent played out just a few years later in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. This is where things get really complicated. How do we even make sense of all this?
Well, the annexation of Crimea was bold. It was a land grab that took the world by surprise. It happened quickly, relatively bloodless. And they achieved their objective. They took this strategically important peninsula, but it also marked a major escalation in Russia's assertiveness, a clear violation of international law, and a turning point in their relations with the West.
And then you have the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine where Russian-backed separatists are fighting against Ukrainian forces. This has been going on for years with thousands of people killed and countless people displaced. It's a tragedy that's a direct result of Russia's intervention.
The conflict in eastern Ukraine is a classic example of hybrid warfare. Russia denies they're directly involved, but they provide support to the separatists. So it creates this really murky and dangerous situation.
Yeah.
And it's been devastating for Ukraine, fracturing the country and fueling tensions that ultimately led to
The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This is where everything comes to a head, right? This is like the culmination of Russia's pattern of interventions, a major escalation that's thrown Europe into its biggest conflict since World War II.
Yeah, the invasion of Ukraine, it's a defining moment, a
Yeah.
total game changer with enormous consequences. It shattered any hope for peace in Europe, led to these unprecedented sanctions against Russia, and really rallied the West to support Ukraine.
It's a stark reminder of just how costly conflict can be, the devastation these interventions can cause. It leaves the whole world wondering what's next. What does Russia do now?
Before we jump into that question, there's one more intervention we need to discuss. Syria. Starting in 2015, Russia gets involved in the Syrian civil war, providing crucial military support to Assad's regime, which was struggling to hold on. This intervention was really significant. It helped Assad regain control over a large part of the country.
So while the world was focused on Ukraine, Russia was also flexing its muscles in the Middle East. supporting an authoritarian regime and further expanding their global reach. It's a reminder that Russia's playing on multiple levels with interests and ambitions all over the world.
Exactly. And Syria adds another dimension to our understanding of Russia's interventions. It shows they're willing to jump into complex conflicts way beyond their borders, often going after strategic objectives that aren't just about their immediate neighbors.
It's clear these interventions aren't just random events, they fit into a bigger pattern of behavior. But as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what this all means for the future. What lessons can we learn from Russia's history of interventions, and how might those lessons help us understand what's to come? So as we reflect on all these interventions, is there like a big takeaway? What really stands out to you?
You know what's really striking is just how consistent Russia's motivations have been. Even as the world has changed around them, whether it's the Soviet Union back in the Cold War or Russia today, there's this constant drive to maintain a sphere of influence, to keep the West at bay and project their power both in their region and globally.
So control, influence, and power. But have their methods stayed the same? I mean, we see this shift from these massive invasions during the Soviet era to like a more subtle approach in recent decades. Things like hybrid warfare, supporting separatists, and even being able to deny involvement.
Oh, absolutely. Russia has definitely adapted its tactics. They've gotten a lot more sophisticated. It's like they use this blend of military force, economic pressure, spreading information, and even cyber attacks to get what they want.
Do you think the whole Soviet experience in Afghanistan remember that costly and unsuccessful intervention?
Oh, yeah.
You think that changed how they approach things later on?
I think they definitely learned some hard lessons there. In Afghanistan, they face a really determined enemy,
Right.
tough terrain, and the world was not happy with them. So in later interventions, you see them being more cautious and calculated, trying to minimize the risks and the costs.
But even with that more cautious approach, they're still willing to use brute force when they think it's necessary, like we saw in Chechnya, Georgia, and of course, Ukraine.
That's right. Russia isn't afraid to unleash their military might when they feel like something really important is at stake, or when they think they can win quickly and decisively.
So, given this long and complicated history of interventions, what do you think is next? What can we expect from Russia on the world stage going forward?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
It's tough to say for sure, but looking back can give us some clues. I think Russia will probably continue to focus on what they see as their backyard, keeping those former Soviet republics in line and making sure they don't side with the West.
So we could see more of them meddling in places like Moldova, Georgia, maybe even Central Asia.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. And we can't rule out them getting involved in other places where they think they have interests, like the Middle East or Africa.
What about the invasion of Ukraine? Has that changed things for Russia, like fundamentally?
I think the invasion of Ukraine is a real turning point.
Yeah.
It's led to these massive sanctions, brought together countries against them, and isolated Russia like we haven't seen since the Cold War. We're still seeing the effects of it, but it's going to have a huge impact on what happens to Russia in the future.
That's a lot to think about. Well, this deep dive into Russian and Soviet military interventions has been really eye-opening. We've gotten a glimpse into why they do what they do, the methods they use, and how it's all impacted the world, and it's left us with a lot to ponder.
For sure. I'll leave our listeners with one final thought. Given this complex history, how do you think these interventions will shape Russia's role in the world going forward? Will they become even more assertive, more isolated, or maybe find a completely new path?
That's a great question, and one we can all think about. We've only scratched the surface here, but hopefully this deep dive has made you curious to learn even more. There's a ton of information out there, so keep digging, keep asking those tough questions, and never stop diving deep.